Cabernet tends to be the sort of Errol Flynn of the grape varieties.
To meet a global bartending legend.
People always ask, how do you get involved in sake and how does that connect to music?
Great single malt whiskey is made in the brewery.
Conventional winemakers who just condemn all natural wine as faulty.
Exploded onto the Australian brewing scene.
A really beautiful, harmonious community of artisan producers.
All these geopolitical incidents will affect whiskey down the line.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Welcome back to the Drinks Adventures podcast, and this episode I'm joined by James Harvey and Tom Davies of Yulli's Brews in Sydney. Yulli's was founded in 2014 by Karl Cooney of the popular Sydney restaurant Yulli's, together with James Harvey, a passionate home brewer. Yulli's makes 100% vegan beer. Now these days, the vast majority of beers on the market are vegan, and in fact Lion, the number 2 brewer in Australia, has informed me that all its beers are vegan. However, I know for a fact there's still a lot of confusion out there about which beers meet this classification. So I invited James, better known as Harves, and Tom, Yulli's head brewer, for a chat on this topic. We also discuss Yulli's journey to date, its expansion into making sake, and an interesting beer-wine hybrid they have in the pipeline. Since recording this interview, Yulli's, like many other breweries, has been forced to close its Alexandria taproom due to COVID-19. You can support them during this difficult time by seeking out their beers from bottle shops near you. You'll hear in a moment from James how he met Karl and together they founded Yulli's. And make sure that when we get past this horrible virus, you visit the Yulli's taproom in Sydney for some great beers and Yulli's outstanding vegan food prepared in their on-site kitchen. Now, I'm no brewer or distiller, but I have a fair few friends in the industry who are, and I know where they go to source the ingredients they need to make the wonderful beers and spirits that we all enjoy drinking. I'm talking, of course, about Bintani. With experts in all categories on the team, Bintani understands how brewing and distilling ingredients work together like no other supplier. Bintani handpicks the best.
So I started working back at Yulli's restaurant in Surrey Hills, but it started back in 2008. I started working there in about the end of 2009 and got introduced to Karl there. I was very young. I would have been 19 at the time. Started washing dishes with him. I worked there for a number of years and then eventually was kind of managing the restaurant there. Throughout that time, got very well introduced to good beer because we were putting on quite a lot of good local beer. And throughout that sort of process, got to meet a lot of the local brewers and was fortunate enough to meet a few that were happy to take me along to their breweries and show me what's going on, how beer's made, and developed a pretty keen interest on it quite quickly. Around that kind of time, I was doing a lot of home brewing and got to a point where I entered myself into a competition about a year or two into it, and funnily enough won, which was a big surprise, and it kind of just gave myself and Karl a lot of confidence at that point in time to have a crack and start making something that we'd been talking about for quite a few years. So we put all those ideas into place and put a bit of money down and got towards working on a liquor license and a brand, and a few months later ended up getting ready to go and made our first commercial batch of Norman. And it was a very, very small enterprise at that point. We were doing little 1 to 2 keg a week sort of sales here and there, mainly through the restaurant in Surrey Hills, and if we got on a pub, that would just be amazing. But soon enough, people started to catch on to a couple of things, and we had a couple more venues and started pushing out a couple of different interesting beers and working with a lot of the other smaller local breweries around Sydney that would allow us to come in and contract a little brew here and there. And that operation kind of existed and grew to a point that was a little bit too big for that operation about 3 years into it, where we decided to dive in and mortgage everything and build a little brewery over in Alexandria. And that's a couple of years on. That's where we are today with a pretty epic-sized brewery. For our standards, it's still massive, and we're making beer supplying mainly New South Wales, but largely around the whole country. We've got beer from WA and Victoria, a bit up in Queensland, some down in South Australia, and that's sort of where we're at for now.
Is the vegan ideology, is that you and Karl, or is that just Karl?
Oh, it definitely comes from Karl. It's definitely where it all started. The whole Yulli's as a restaurant opened up initially as being a bar with a little bit of veggie food on the side, and it turns out that the veggie food had a lot more following at the time, and quite quite quickly a pretty bustling restaurant was in demand. And so the food took the fore there for quite a while. Soon enough, once the beer operation was underway, we just made the decision that when we open this venue up, let's go full vegan. And it's been a great decision. And obviously with that has come that our beer is also vegan, which hasn't been as difficult a process as one might think. It just means we steer clear from a couple of key ingredients here and there, and our processes just need to be pretty in line with what is and isn't vegan. But I guess in answer to your question, it doesn't more so come from me, it comes from my business partner Karl, where it all kicked off.
But when you first set out making beer, would the beers that you had been making originally, would they have classified as vegan?
Most of the time, yeah. About 95% of them were, with the odd one here and there where we'd use an ingredient like, say, maybe lactose or honey, which, funnily enough, isn't vegan. So yeah, with the odd cases of a specialty batch that includes a product that isn't vegan, then no, it wouldn't have been a vegan product, but we just made the decision to make it a blanket rule that everything is vegan, and obviously the food that comes out of the brewery kitchen is all vegan, and everything we do across the board now, so even at the restaurant in Surrey Hill, that made the switch over to vegan, and our restaurant up in Byron as well.
I think it's actually something that people are kind of surprised by when they sort of hear that beer isn't vegan or may not be vegan. For people who don't know, what are some of the products that have historically been used in the brewing process that are animal-derived?
Tom's probably better at answering.
Yeah, so there's a few different ones that have been used in history. Isinglass is probably the most common one, which is actually a fish-derived product, and that's been used mainly as a filtration aid. So it's really good at bonding the yeast out of a beer and kind of, dropping it out before you then filter. And so it was used in a lot of big commercial breweries, probably up until kind of the 2000s or so. It seems to have been kind of reduced, a lot in terms of its usage. We were talking as well, even a big brand like Guinness, only about 10 years ago or so, completely stopped their kind of use of isinglass.
I think it was actually more recently than that, in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So you've got isinglass is a really well-known one that I think a lot of people talk about. The other big one is gelatin. So gelatin isn't used hugely anymore, but when people homebrew a lot, that's kind of the classic one they'd originally use, which is derived from kind of an animal collagen. Gelatin's quite often used in cider as well, as a bit of a fining agent to pull the yeast out. So you still find a lot of the big commercial guys still use that. And then the big one, I guess, more in the craft game and something that's a bit more relevant to us, where we've occasionally had a bit of a challenge, is lactose. So lactose is like a milk-derived kind of sweetness or sugar derived from milk. It's often used in kind of anything from a milk stout where you're just wanting to add a little bit of sweetness. One of the big trends at the moment is kind of your milkshake IPA, and they're using lots of lactose, but even in kind of sours and stuff like that. And so I guess for us, particularly when we're designing recipes, even now, it's often, you look at trying to make a recipe with that kind of ingredient, but just for us, it's, something that's off the board and kind of got to find alternatives to try to generate the same flavours. Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of a misconception that beers are not vegan. I think generally most breweries nowadays don't use that, but that's very different to them, saying they're kind of certified vegan, which we know is a much more kind of a lot of steps and process in terms of the approval process for that. And so we're not even, on our cans, we don't put that we're certified vegan. It's, maybe something that we'd look at down the line, but I just don't think it's really necessary. But it's also not a requirement from a labelling point of view. You actually, in the beverage market, don't need to label that.
What do you use now instead if you want a beer to go bright and clear? Do you need to use something else to help with fining it?
We only use it now in one of our products. Most of our products we try to kind of avoid that, but just in our lager, when you're looking for that kind of really clean, crisp, bright beer in a glass and stuff like that, you obviously need some kind of aid. A lot of larger breweries would use something like a centrifuge. We obviously don't have kind of the scale to be quite at that point yet, but we use a silica-based agent. So it's a silica acid basically in solution, and you just kind of combine that with a little bit of beer and it'll bond through it and really act very similarly to isinglass or gelatin of the day, but it's just a silica-derived compound instead.
So you guys seem to think that the use of some of those products has been phased out by most of the brewers around these days?
I would have thought so, yeah. I don't know anyone that still uses those ingredients. I mean, aside from Guinness in more recent years that was using it, but I don't know of one that is still using it.
I think it's still pretty widespread in wine in finding this.
Wines are probably a bit of a different one because, and I'm not a winemaker, but my basic understanding is that they use quite a lot of egg whites, and that's usually generally what classifies a lot of wines as not vegan. And we, even when we opened the brewery's tap room, when we were opening the restaurant and trying to choose a few wines to put on the list, we'd suddenly run into a lot of trouble pretty quickly. We'd pick out all these wines and then talk to friends that were winemakers and go, they just need to be vegan, and they'd go, oh no, we use egg whites in all of our wines. So it's probably on the wine side of things is still a bit more of a topic.
Do you think that it's been beneficial for you guys that vegan people they don't even have to think about it, they kind of know that your whole brand is 100% vegan, and so they know that, Yulli's is a place they can go and they know that everything is going to be hunky-dory?
Yeah, I do think that would work in our favour. I mean, quite incidentally, to be honest, it wasn't a conscious decision to say, hey, let's capture this audience here who's, this growing audience of veganisms, to bring in an audience to our brewery. It more just happened to be that, obviously Karl's vegan, and we just made it that blanket rule from the get-go, and it was more of a focus on, on quality product that just happens to be vegan, as opposed to let's make vegan food or beer, But I do think you're right, that it has probably captured an audience that does feel, a lot safer around our vegan environment and our vegan products, where they can come and look at literally everything and not have to make a tough decision. The vegan audience, they're pretty happy to make an effort to find good vegan food. I think they're pretty used to having a scarce amount of product and venues out there that will dedicate a whole venue or a whole list to their dietary requirements. So yeah, it does tend to work in our favour for that. We get a lot of local repeat customers, big time.
How has the product range evolved since you launched? And Norman was kind of like your flagship, from what I can tell, for quite a while there.
Quite a while, yeah. Oh, it's developed in a big way. Yeah, as you said, Norman was the main man for quite a number of years there, but Seabass has grown quite exponentially since his release, and he is by far our number one guy at the moment. Turns out there's a pretty large market for a quality craft lager. Besides from that, we've kind of always prided ourselves on having a very dynamic range that covers quite a lot of bases, that has a pretty big focus on drinkability, beers that aren't ultra challenging but still very interesting, whilst also having a crack at the pointy end of some weird barrel-aged sours and massive stouts and more crafty, I guess, kind of beers.
And Tom, what are your favourite beer styles to make, or do you, consider yourself a bit of a generalist?
Yeah, I think the more you kind of spend time in beer and stuff, you find yourself going back to the original styles. I think that everyone's always got kind of a learning curve with that kind of thing, and you suddenly find yourself almost back at the start. So, like lagers, particularly recently, we make a lager that we did in collaboration with a restaurant up in the Northern Rivers called Astrid, and it was basically working with this guy's called Josh from Fleet. Fleet was the originally restaurant he started, which has got, I think, at least a hat, maybe two. He just worked with us to try and design a beer that was going to work with their restaurant, which is just a simple lager to go with their Mexican food up there. It's a collaboration with La Casita, where we basically used a bit of pineapple, a little bit of coriander seed, and a thing called a ancho chili, which I'd never even heard of before, but they're kind of not a spicy chili, just kind of a lot more chili flavour. And he introduced me to kind of all these ingredients, and we made a pretty easy drinking lager, which is all about subtlety out of it. And if you talk to any of our brewers, including myself, it's kind of all of us go to that beer more than anything at the moment. Particularly I think when you're still working in the brewery as well, at the end of the day, what you're really looking for is something easier drinking. But in terms of brewing side of stuff, we've been having a lot of fun, across the spectrum, working with lots of fruit. I think that's something that we've kind of definitely started to get really good at, is using fruit in beers. And I think it's, for us as well, from a sales side of things, it's really obvious that people are kind of getting more and more keen. We make a mango pale ale called Mum's Mango, and it's just every time we kind of make a batch of that, it flies off. Working with fruit's really interesting, both from kind of how you deal with it from a sanitation side of things as well, particularly. A lot of people really struggle to work out how to get fruit into beer in a way that it's going to be kind of stable on the shelf. So yeah, I kind of find more the technical side of that kind of thing more interesting, rather than just trying to make the biggest, haziest, hoppiest beer or anything like that.
This episode of Drinks Adventures is supported by Fever Tree Premium Mixers, the mixer of choice in the world's best bars and restaurants. Right now, I'm enjoying Fever Tree's smoky ginger ale as the perfect accompaniment to some of my favourite bourbons and whiskies. Now, we love sake here at Drinks Adventures, and I was excited some time ago to see that you guys were having a crack at making sake. How did that evolve?
This was never part of the plan, to be honest. It definitely crept up on us in a way that got us very excited quite quickly, and there's something we couldn't turn down, the idea of having a crack at making our own. But a little while back, we were hosting monthly markets to showcase some local products, whether it's sauces and pickles and cosmetic stuff or anything from a local supplier. And a local Japanese lady named Chiho came and introduced herself one day just to show us her homemade sake that she was making. She'd been having a crack at it for a little while at home, just on a very experimental basis. And Carl and I were fascinated from the get-go and thought it was delicious, something that we'd never really even tasted before. Her style of sake, everyone knows or has maybe had a slight experience of what sake might be, but hers was super unique and something we just couldn't pass up. So yeah, quite quickly we got her on board with hosting her own little stall at the markets and showcasing what she was up to, and it proved to be quite popular quite quickly, and particularly with us. We were just so interested in it, and so we brought her on board and she was working with us part-time. We were developing these sake products, and quite quickly it got to a point where we needed her on full-time. So it was about 9 months into her working with us that we had fully developed these two sake products that we wanted to release to the market. One being our seishu, which is a clear sake, a junmai, which is aimed at being a very approachable, light, easy drinking, somewhat user-friendly style sake, and then the other being a lot more of an experimental style nigori sake. It's been a hell of an experience and something we're continually evolving and sort of learning as we go. We don't claim to be sake aficionados or experts or anything. We're just having a crack at our style of sake. We do get a few classic Japanese sake enthusiasts and people that are quite knowledgeable on the style of sake and everything that is done over in Japan, kind of challenging our product and our techniques of how it's made, and which is fair enough because over there it's quite strict and stringent. There's a lot of rules as to what you can and can't do and to call it sake. But over here we're obviously not really governed by any sake bodies or anything like that. It still is sake. It's made from water, yeast, koji and rice. There's no two ways about that. But yeah, ours is just obviously a bit of a local Australian take on such an ancient Japanese beverage.
Tell me about the milling process and the type of rice that you're using and all those kinds of details.
So we actually don't mill any of our rice, mainly because we don't have access to a miller. But we use just organic New South Wales grown table rice as our base rice. Our koji is made in 10 kilo batches up on the Gold Coast and shipped down to us every time we make a batch. And we're doing it on a very small scale at the moment. It's still, we're doing it sort of 60 to 100 litre batches at a time. Just enough for what we need at the moment.
And when you're using unmilled rice, does that sort of mean you get a richer, more full-bodied kind of sake?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you will get quite a lot of flavour from our sake. It's not ultra light and super delicate kind of flavour profile from both of them. It's definitely a little bit more in that kind of umami sort of flavour profile.
Now you guys just mentioned on your way in that you're on your way out to Mudgee to work on a beer wine hybrid. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about that?
So yeah, Will from Gilbert Family Winery out in Mudgee is a very good friend of mine. I went to school with him. We talk quite a lot and we've done a lot of work with him in the past, made a beer or two using whether it's his grapes or his barrels, and then we stock a lot of his wines at our brewery and vice versa at his cellar door. We've been talking about this idea for quite a while of basically making a product that is halfway between what we do. Cut a long story short, we're going out to Mudgee tomorrow to pick a whole bunch of grapes that have been tainted from some of the most recent bushfire smoke, and we're going to bring those grapes back to the brewery. And I'll probably let Tom talk you through the more technical brewing process behind it, but it's going to be quite an interesting...
Yeah, it's going to be a long time, even after kind of people listening to this before it kind of comes out as a product. It's definitely going to be kind of on the mixed fermentation side of stuff, and so we'll probably have to spend quite a lot of time in oak and things like that, but we'll basically taking smoke affected fruit, about 600 or 700 kilos, which would normally just be going Gilbert was saying that any of the kind of fruit that they can't use, they just will end up as cattle feed. But so we'll take that and kind of mix some fresh wort basically out of the brewery with that, and hopefully kind of get a really nice blend of some kind of wildish cultures that come off the grapes. And really, I think, the most important thing with this kind of thing, when it's very uncharted territory for us and for most people and things like that, is hopefully just to go with our guts. I think we're more going to kind of let whatever yeast and wild kind of bacteria that's on the grapes just do its thing, which I guess is something that's becoming more popular in the natural wine side of stuff as well. And then hopefully at the end of it, we'll kind of end up with something that's going to be a really good hybrid. But we're using red grapes, so we should definitely get a lot of colour from that as well. So I guess there's probably a little bit more information to come as we find out as well, but it probably won't be out for 9 months, I'd say.
Do you think that you're still going to get those smoky flavours in whatever beer that you make?
Whenever you kind of do a beer-wine hybrid, one of the biggest advantages you have is, when you're making a wine, for example, that's kind of 13 or 14%, it's purely from grape juice, and so whatever flavour you're kind of going to get from those grapes is going to be as concentrated as it is in the grapes. When you make a beer, generally, if you think about it, you only use say 2,000 litres of beer. You're only going to use 300 or 400 kilos of barley, so it's quite a diluted solution beer generally. Whereas wine is usually just whole fruit pressed, and so any kind of faults that you pick up from that side of stuff, you usually find firstly going to be diluted. So if it is there, it's not going to be kind of nearly as strong in character, and that's, I guess, just the advantage of that side of stuff. Then separately, beer yeast specifically seems to be quite good as well at cleaning up some of those faults that often come in from the kind of wine generally, and so from at least a couple of other guys I've talked to who have worked with smoke-affected fruit before, once you kind of go through that fermentation stage, you generally don't see a lot of those characteristics showing through.
What else is coming up for Yulli, Harvey?
So it's, as I was saying to you just earlier on, we've had a very, very hectic summer, and in the last couple of years we've just grown into our space quite a lot. So we're very much at capacity at the moment, which is awesome in a lot of ways, but it's getting to the point where it's been stressful, and now we need to sort of move forward a little bit. So we've got at least a tank on the way, and we're starting to look at plans to sort of, I guess, work out how we can fit as much capacity more into our little facility over there, which is proving challenging. But
do you think that facility will be able to accommodate you for the foreseeable future, or are you already starting to think about another location?
We haven't gone beyond our current location just yet.
I'd say it's probably more of a logistic side of things more than anything.
Yeah.
Like the brew house is actually capable of putting out a lot more beer than it currently produces, but it's more that issue of fitting in the tank side of stuff and things like that. And I guess when we moved into the space, it just seemed like heaps and heaps of room, and suddenly you put in a canning line and a nice big cool room and the brew house and the tanks and a restaurant and the venue space on top of that, and suddenly there's no room left. And so what we're kind of struggling at the moment with is just that there's no room for fermentation space really. The brew house could easily produce twice as much beer as we make now, so it's just probably going to be moving some stuff off site maybe in terms of storage and things like that, and hopefully we can squeeze it in, that's the hope.
Cool. Well, sounds like I'm due for a return visit then, because it's obviously filled out a lot since I was last there. Yeah. Guys, might leave it there. Thanks so much for the chat.
No worries. Thanks for having us.
Easy.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson. Like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people that this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.